Thumbnail? Hate my life. All right, everybody, in this video, I'm gonna reveal to you the depths of my OCD as I search for the perfect lightweight but durable cycling boot. That's what we're gonna talk about, boots and bikes in this video. Welcome back, Pathless Peddlers, and if you're new to the channel, you probably know I am a little bit obsessive with some things, but if you're into riding party pace and living the supple life, you have found your people, hit that subscribe button. So for the last couple of years, I have been searching for the perfect cycling boot. And to me, what that means, it's a boot that is durable, has a good grip in the sole to interact with pedals, but is also lightweight. And you'd be surprised how difficult it is to find those three qualities in one boot. So on the table here, I have 8 boots, which are among my favorite. And shockingly, these aren't all the boots I've tried, but these are the ones I've really bubbled up to the surface. And I know before we get started, someone is already writing every boot is a cycling boot. And while it is true, you can pedal in your 3-pound lumberjack boots, probably not the best boot when there are lighter and more flexible options out there. And full disclaimer, some of these boots I have purchased and a few have been sent in for this video. So the way I'm gonna approach this video is to start from here and work my way across, talking a little bit about each boot, what I like about them and also what I dislike, and ultimately have 1 or 2 picks that I highly recommend. And of course, because this is a cycling channel, I will weigh them for the weight weenies. Not that it's super important to me, but I know some of you, care about those things. So let's start off with this guy. This is one of 2 boots in this lineup that comes specifically from a bike brand. And this is by the brand 510, and it's their mid-top cycling boot. This is meant for winter purposes, so a little bit bulkier, and also has a waterproof liner. So on our scales here, this one shoe weighs in at 515 grams, so a little bit on the chunky side, but that's sort of expected for a boot. They're going to be typically heavier than the equivalent shoe, but I think this one in particular has a tendency to be overbuilt. Looking at the ankle cuffs here, they're really padded. Same thing with the tongue. It's just a pretty beefy shoe, and this is great for when the weather turns south. We've ridden successfully in these for extended periods of time when the weather is kind of hovering around freezing. It does pretty good in the 30s and 40s. Once it gets a little bit colder than that, then it is a bit of a challenge. So in terms of likes, I think it's a pretty nice looking boot. Generally pretty svelte looking, even though its weight. Probably its biggest asset, however, is the sticky rubber. 510 makes some of the best soles in the business, and this is definitely probably the grippiest boot amongst all of these. That said, probably not my go-to for an all-rounder boot. It is on the heavy side, and I would turn to this during those shoulder seasons with kind of borderline weather. But during the warmer months or when I want a lighter cycling boot, this would not be it. So moving on, this is the Blundstone. I believe this is the 505, 501, I'm not sure exactly. And already I can sense someone writing, Blundstone sold out, you should get Redbacks. Okay, whatever. I got Blundstones, that's what I'm reviewing. And on our scales, this weighs in at 533 grams. So interestingly, you can see that these are actually pretty close in weight. So either this is really heavy or this is fairly light for its size. So this style of boot is called a Chelsea, and what defines a Chelsea is that it doesn't have any laces, it's a slip-on boot. It has a stretchy fabric here, which is called goring. And this boot, for me, is really, really comfortable. Out of the box, super comfy, super plush, but there are some things I have issue with this boot. Of all these boots, I've cycled in the Blundstones the longest. I had a pair, not this one specifically, but a different one that I retired after almost a decade, which we rode parts of the Northern Tier, 3 months in New Zealand, and all over here in Montana. I have a lot of familiarity with this boot for cycling, and it's kind of influenced my choices going down the line. So the Blundstone is waterproof, and I have tested this. I've actually used these sometimes for fishing when I'm too lazy to put on boots and waders. And as long as you don't go above the goring, it will keep your foot fairly dry when it's new. Things I like about cycling in the Blundstone is the easy on and off. No laces to tie. I'm terrible at tying laces. No laces to get caught on your drivetrain, and it's really comfortable. In terms of the sole, this is a pretty good sole for walking and hiking for me. For pedals, it works pretty well on most pedals I've tried. There are some pedals that don't play well with the Blundstones. If you have an all alloy pedal and the pins aren't very aggressive, these tend to be a little bit slippy. But if you've got a pedal like the EC Thump or the Catalyst pedals are a little bit wider and have really aggressive teeth, then they work well with this boot and actually all these boots. Another thing I really like is that for me it has a fairly wide-ish toe box, so lots of good toe flexibility. And it is a little bit of a looser fit. If you're used to a super tight-fitting road shoe, then Chelsea style boots probably aren't for you. But I like them because it gives a lot of layering opportunities. We did a ride a couple years ago called the Ochiko Overlander, and one year it was, 4 days of freezing rain, and I was so glad I had these rather than trying to use a road shoe and a cover. And although my toes got chilled by the end of 4 days of freezing rain, it could have been much worse if I was riding in a regular shoe. In terms of dislikes, it is, as we saw via the scale, a little bit on the chonky side. And also for me, in recent years, I've gravitated to more minimalist shoes, such as this shoe by Xero. And as you can tell, the Blundstone definitely not minimalist. A pretty noticeable heel to toe drop. I think it's about 8 millimeters. And if you're going from 0 drop or less drop than that, then you will notice that. Also, I feel like the sole is overbuilt for cycling. I mean, it wasn't designed as a cycling shoe, I understand that. But since I'm following my obsession, just thought I would point it out. So I think this is a pretty great cycling boot if you're not too concerned about weight, if you're not fully into the whole minimalist shoe thing. These are pretty easy to find. You can get these at your local REI. And speaking of finding these boots, I will put a link to all of them in the description below. And yes, they will be affiliate links to help the channel. So moving from the Blundstones, I really wanted to go the opposite direction and find something more minimal than a big Chelsea boot. And I started really exploring the notion of a Chukka. So a Chukka, or a desert boot. So a Chukka, aka a desert boot, looks like this. Typically only 2 or 3 eyelets, fairly lightweight. Traditional Chukkas are built with a crepe sole, which aren't so great for cycling because pedals will tear that sole to shreds. So if you're looking for a Chukka style boot, you do want to find one with either a rubber sole or Vibram sole or something other than the traditional crepe sole. This one in particular is by the brand SeaVees. Again, not a cycling brand, but I love the shape of it. And mostly I wanted to try it out because it did have an alternative to the crepe sole. So let's see. I know someone's going to tell me it's not crepe, it's creepy or something. On the scales, 393 grams. So as you can see, we are getting progressively lighter. This was 393. This was, I think, 530 something. This one is in the 5s again. So noticeably lighter than the 2 previous options. And I rode in these boots when we were in Arizona last winter. And I loved it for that. It's actually fairly roomy. You can see here the ankle cuff is really unpadded as opposed to something like the 510. So I do appreciate a little bit more minimal cuff on the shoe. I think it just adds excessive weight and bulk. In terms of flexibility, it's pretty flexible when walking, but is rigid enough on the bike. There's a lot I like about this SeaVees Chukka. One kind of real big deal breaker is the sole. While it's not a crepe sole or crepe sole, however you want to pronounce it, and it didn't tear up, because of its herringbone pattern, it was spaced a little bit too close together and didn't engage well with any pedal. All that to say, it was on the slippy side. I think if they made this boot, this desert boot, with something like this sole that's on the Xero, this would be awesome. So that is the SeaVees Chukka. Again, getting a little bit closer. We've shed some weight, changed boot styles, but not quite there yet. Okay, moving on. So the next boot we're gonna look at is also a Chukka. You can see it's got a similar form factor. Again, 3 eyelets, mid-cuff design, fairly minimal. And this one is by the brand Lems. I've talked about this boot in particular a couple times in different videos, and it is truly one of my favorites. Let's put it on the scales. Gets better, 253. 253 grams, a full 100 grams lighter than this guy. And this one is made out of a canvas upper. And again, it has lots of things I like, very minimal cuff here, no excessive bulk whatsoever. This one, because it is a minimalist shoe brand, if you look at the last here of the foot, definitely wider and less pointy than this shoe over here. So more foot shape to give you more natural toe splay, lots of room for socks and what have you. In terms of flexibility, it's pretty flexible here. You can actually almost like crush it. It's that flexible. Looking at the sole, while it's not a super aggressive lug, let's say like something on the Blundstones here, the rubber is pretty soft and it does engage well with a lot of the pedals that I use. If you're using like a flat rubber pedal, then this isn't going to work. But again, if you've got a decent pedal with traction pins like the EC Thumps or the Callus, then this works great. Probably the only caveat with this shoe is if you're not already accustomed to a zero drop, highly flexible shoe, it can lead to some calf strain walking or even biking. When I first got the shoe, absolutely loved it. Felt great on the foot, lightweight, but I couldn't take it on super long rides because I would get kind of a cramping sensation in my calves. Many months down the road, I think I've fully acclimated to this shoe, so now it's definitely up there on one of my favorite cycling boots. If there are any downsides to this Lems Chukka, it's that I wish it came in a leather version. I feel like the canvas does attract some dirt. I'd love some more waterproofing of a leather version of this. They do have a suede version, which I've not tried. I don't know if that stains anymore because of the textured surface, but I'd love to see a smooth grain leather version of this Chukka. Hopefully in the future they'll have one, fingers crossed. Okay, moving on. This is another brand that a lot of you guys have recommended, and it is the brand Xero. Laura has been riding and running in one of their more minimalist trail running shoes, and we both decided to pick up a pair of their boots that came out this year. So again, this is a Chelsea style boot. You can tell by the goring and lack of laces. On the scale, this one weighs in at 380 grams. So surprisingly, this is a little bit heavier than this guy by almost 100 grams. So the things I like about this boot is that it is a Chelsea. I love the Chelsea design when going bike touring or bikepacking because there's no laces to deal with. Let's say you have let's say nature calls in the middle of the night. You don't have to deal with laces. You can just slip this on your foot, do your business, and go back to sleep. I do also love its relative lightweight when compared with a more traditional Chelsea or even the cycling specific boot by 510. But there are some downsides, and one of them, at least for me, is the sole. As you can see, it's super thin, and although I've acclimated to minimalist shoes like the Lems, this one takes it a step further. I do need a little bit more cushion than this provides, so walking long distances on this boot doesn't really work for me. However, on the bike, it's not so bad, and it's actually a pretty good cycling shoe. One thing I do like about it is the textured sole. I do find it a little bit grippier than the Lems. Probably the biggest downside of this boot for me is the fit. It feels a little bit sloppy in the midfoot. I have it dialed in terms of length and width, but here it's a little bit loose and it just doesn't feel great to me cycling long distances. You can compensate with more socks, and surprisingly, this does make a fairly good shoulder season to early winter boot because there is so much space here. You can really layer on those socks. But for my feet, cycling in the summer, cycling in longer distances, the fit isn't there for me. Okay, so almost there. We've got 3 more boots to go. I'm gonna move these guys over and talk about these two at the same time. So these 2 boots are both by Lems, and these 2 were sent in for review. This is the mid-top version of their Boulder boot, which is usually up about here, or actually up about here. And this one is neither a Chelsea or a Chukka. I guess it's just a little bit of a hiking boot. It does have a mock toe. And as you can see, it's got a lot of similarities with the other Lems boot here. So again, nice and foot-shaped. Lots of wiggle room for the toes, lots of room to put in socks and what have you. It is a lace-up design, so not quite as convenient to take on and off, but because it does have traditional laces, it means you can really dial in the fit. You can skip some holes to add some room or tighten it down different sections of the foot. So on our scale, this is 299 grams. So lighter than this, heavier than this, and lighter than these 3. So this is pretty cool because, I mean, you've got a pretty herky looking boot, but at the fraction of the weight. Again, it's got a very similar sole to the canvas version of the Chukka. So while it doesn't have the most aggressive tread, it is made of a softer material, so traction pins do work pretty well with these soles, but these aren't so soft that they'll get eaten up like a crepe sole, so don't worry about that. It does mean, however, if you have to do a little bit of a hike-a-bike and things are really muddy and sloppy, these probably won't have the best purchase on that kind of terrain. On the bike, if you're just pedaling in good conditions, this is an awesome boot. It's light, it's got good ankle protection for when you're walking or hiking, but because it is a little bit lower cut, you still have lots of flexibility when you're on the bike. And did I mention this thing only weighs 299 grams? Even though this is a boot, it weighs a lot lighter than those Pearl Izumi shoes that I reviewed a couple weeks ago. This boot does gain a little bit more padding in the collar. I think they envisioned this more for the shoulder season, so it does run a little bit warmer, a little bit more bulk than the canvas version. And because of that, you also want to size up. So I'm a solid size 9 in the canvas Chukka. This is a size 9 in the Boulder boot. I should have sized up to 9.5 to compensate for the added material. So if you're a fan of this guy and want to try this, definitely go up at least half a size. So let's move on to this one. This is the waterproof version of the Boulder boot. So it is the full height version, as well as having a waterproof membrane embedded into the boot. As long as you don't, go over this edge, your feet will stay dry. Let's see what this weighs. On our scales, it weighs in at 406 grams. So probably the heaviest of all these minimalist style boots. Not a surprise, however, because it is taller and has that waterproof material. So for this one, I went up a full size, anticipating that I would run a thicker sock with this, and that was a good choice. A thicker sock with this boot actually does fairly well for me in the temps, hovering around freezing and slightly below. There's something about the, wider foot last and more space, and the fact that it has a flexible sole that increases circulation while you're riding in colder temperatures. And although it doesn't have the same insulation as a weather boot, it performs admirably well. So one big concern I had about cycling in this boot is that it is a high top, and I worried that it would hinder ankle mobility. And to some extent it does when it's laced all the way up to the top. For me, I leave the top eyelet unlaced, and that compensates for that. In some ways, you can use this as a dual purpose boot. If you're hiking, you can lace it up all the way to the top. If you're cycling and you need a little bit more ankle mobility, you can leave the two top eyelets untouched and run it essentially like a mid-top version. Again, it has the similar sole to the mid-top version, as well as the canvas Chukka. The biggest difference, of course, is the waterproof membrane. I feel like that adds lots of extra warmth. It feels noticeably warmer than the not waterproof version in the mid-top. So I think if you're going to be riding your bike in colder climates, in wetter climates, let's say Portland, Seattle, somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, then this is a pretty good boot to check out. Again, because it has traditional laces, there's lots of flexibility in dialing in that fit. Nice big toe box for natural foot splay, as well as room to layer sock. I think both these boots are awesome options. This one would make a great boot for cycling into the warmer months, whereas this one I'd probably restrict to those shoulder seasons or winter months. Okay, so we are on to the last boot. This is by the brand Pedaled, and yes, this boot was sent in to review. Pedaled, if you're not familiar, they're based in Japan. They do the designing in Japan, but the construction is in Italy. And I have to say, this is a super plush boot. It's fashioned after a classic hiking boot, if you will, like a Danner, but stripped down and made a little bit more cycling specific. Of all the boots, it is the most expensive, but you can tell just by how plush and soft leather is, and the construction and fit and finish of this boot is just top notch. It's worth the money. Yes, it's spendy, but you can see where the money went into. What's interesting about this boot is they didn't just take a hiking boot and relabeled it as a cycling boot. They did do some changes. Probably the most noticeable one here is this drop cut here in the heel. So while this is a high top, lace is fairly high. Because of this and it's just general construction, there's actually a lot of mobility. I really had no problem feeling constricted when biking in this boot in terms of the ankle. Another way that it differs from a hiking boot is if you look at the sole here, it does have aggressive lugs. This is a Vibram sole, but if you look at it from the side, it's actually fairly low profile, as opposed to something like the Blundstones, which has aggressive lugs but is also really tall. These are pretty low profile, and I think that's one of the big differences from this and just like a regular hiking boot. There's a lot to like about this boot. I mean, the aesthetics are top-notch if you like this style. It's just a beautiful looking boot. The sole does have fairly aggressive knobs, so if you find yourself walking in muddier situations, it does have better bite than the Lems shoes. That said, it is on the stiffer side, so I've not put a ton of miles on this, so it may break in over time. So as it stands, new out of the box, would not want to walk long distances in this one. You can see it's a lot of work to bend it, as opposed to the Lems, which just gives pretty easily. Stiffness does translate into support when you're on the pedals. I think this boot comes really close to my platonic ideal of a hiking boot turn cycling boot. However, there are a couple things that I wish could be done differently. The first one is the toe box. It does come to a little bit more of a point than I would like. I wish they would adopt a little bit more of a wider foot shape. For me, that just adds to more circulation. Your feet don't get numb, your feet don't get as cold, and it just feels like a more stable platform on the pedal. These boots also run a bit small, so I would definitely size up at least a full size. Another thing I've noticed is that this Vibram sole is pretty hard. So depending on your pedal, although it has kind of more aggressive tread, it can have a tendency to slip off unless you have the traction pins in the right place. So it's kind of an interesting balance. So while the Lems don't have aggressive treads, they are soft enough to let the pins bite into them, whereas these have a really aggressive tread, but the sole is really hard, and in certain situations it can be a little bit slippy. I think over time, as these break in, they will become more comfortable, and maybe these will soften up a little bit better. But if you're into that Danner-esque looking boot, then these are definitely the ones to check out. So we've gone through all these boots. What are my favorites? What do I recommend? So I think I'm gonna give you guys two recommendations, one for a summer style cycling boot that's light and airy, not too hot, but also ones that will work well for those shoulder seasons in the winter in inclement weather. I still think my go-to boot for the summer season is going to be the Lems Canvas Chukka. I mean, this thing is just stupid light, weighs less than 300 grams. What was the weight again? I just checked it again, 253 grams for a Chukka. Lots of flexibility, nice toe box, and a pretty soft rubber that the pins can dig into. It does take some adapting if you're not into, zero drop shoes with a wide toe box. Just give it a couple weeks, give it a couple months. Maybe don't go on long walks right away, but definitely do try it on your bike. And yeah, again, this just bubbles up to the top even after all of these. I do still want them to make a just full-on leather version for a little bit more water resistance and something that doesn't attract dust so much. In terms of shoulder season and riding in crappy weather, I'm going to recommend two of them. And the first one is going to be the Blundstone. I just have so much experience with riding in Blundstones. Again, multiple years, multiple tours, fording creeks and riding in freezing rain. And I know that these, although they're heavy, definitely not minimalist in terms of weight, lugs, drop, and all that stuff, they're pretty dang durable. Like I said, I almost got a whole decade out of a pair just running them through the ringer. They are heavy, so there is that. If you're a weight weenie or super sensitive to those kinds of things, then probably not the boot for you. My second pick for a more weatherproof shoulder season / Pacific Northwest winter cycling boot is going to be the Lems waterproof boot. At 400 grams, it is a whole 130 grams lighter than the Blundstones, but offers a similar waterproofness, at least up to the first few laces. And it's got a wide toe box, it's got laces so you can adjust the fit, and it has a pretty soft but grippy sole. In some ways, this is a pretty bonkers boot when you consider its weatherproofing, its waterproofness, and its warmth for the weight. All that said, all these boots did admirably well. That's why they're on the table, because I did like some quality of them. I really, really, really wanted to love the pedaled boot more. It's such a beautiful looking boot and well constructed, but maybe because I have hobbit feet, as a commenter had suggested, these just aren't working for me. But if you have nice, narrow, and svelte Italian feet, then this boot will definitely work for you. All right, so that is my super niche roundup of looking for the perfect cycling boot. And I guess I should isolate them here. Once again, in summary, these are my 3 picks. For summer, all around riding, it's almost like a sneaker boot, if you will. Lems Chukka in canvas. And for winter riding, when things get wet and cold and even snowy, either the Blundstones if you like big and herky and durable, or the Lems waterproof Boulder if you want something waterproof, but a little bit more svelte, a little bit lighter and wider, and zero drop. Okay, so thanks again for indulging me in this super long video, which hopefully more than 5 of you will watch. But that's one of the fun things about running your own channel, right? You can do a deep dive into very niche topics and hopefully find other people that will appreciate them. So if you appreciate this video, give it a thumbs up, like, share, subscribe. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because we're so close to 100,000. Let's make it happen. And as always, keep the supple side down.